About a week ago, Private Division flew me and some other creators out to the European Space Agency in the Netherlands to playtest their new shiny game, Kerbal Space Program 2. Now, during this time, we were allotted 3 hours to test, experiment, and really just do whatever we wanted to the game. And boy did I try to squeeze everything I could from those 3 short hours. Now, I tried launching a Duna mission with mixed success. I tested out their pre-made rover, and I built some concerningly large rockets. Now, these things I'll cover in more detail in upcoming videos, but I just wanted to take a second to talk about my experience with the game as a whole. The amazing, the average, and the frankly regrettable. Now, alright, that makes it sound like the game has some massive issues, which I want to lead by saying I don't think it does. Starting out, Kerbal Space Program 2 differs greatly from its aging predecessor. Just a quick comparison of the UI from the two games reveals striking differences. The graphics are vastly improved as a whole, and testing out this little plane here, you can really take in just how good things can look. At its best, the extra attention to graphics really can flex its muscles, with these reflections and engine effects vastly adding to the overall immersion. Looking a little closer though, terrain mesh issues, jarring pop-in, and UI weirdness work to subtract from that very same immersion. Now keep in mind, the build that we are playing on is not going to be the final build of the game, and as we were playing, the developers were actively keeping a close eye on any bugs we found. I'm not sure how quickly they could fix a lot of these issues, but in my developer interview, I was assured that the priority from then until launch was predominantly on fixing bugs. Now let's kick it off by talking about the graphics. One of my favorite changes to the game is that things just look far more realistic. The clouds are now existent and also fluffy. The water shines with the sun's reflection, and the engines eject gas in this beautiful hyperbolic pattern. One of the best user-editable graphics improvements has to be the painting though. The paint tool consists of colors that you can edit however you want, and you can either apply them to the entire plane or just a single part. This makes it incredibly easy yet equally versatile for decorating your entire build. You can see here that I made a red plane with black accents in like 20 seconds. It looks better than the majority of all of my other builds in any game. I also gave this larger ship a bit of a makeover here, and while I might be artistically challenged, the tool did do its job. Now, speaking of makeovers, the graphics changes to the planets I visited are just fantastic. You can see here some of these shots panning around Kerbal and Duna, and everything just looks so much less cartoonish. Kerbal has an amazing band of sunlight bend through the atmosphere that looks truly stunning from behind. Duna actually looks like a dusty little ball rather than just, well, red. It's hard to put words to it, but the feeling you get looking at the planets is completely different than in the original game. Perhaps part of that is my unfamiliarity with the new game, but I think that everyone would agree that it absolutely looks better. Moving on to the surface, things look just as good. Now, I started out by using this rover that the developers moved to Tylo, and ignoring the physics of it for now, the landscape is without a doubt better than KSP1. The hills look a lot more realistic, the surface scatter is there to add some realistic rocks around, and some high-resolution textures were clearly used for the surface mesh. Now, this is of course just one landing spot on only one of the bodies, so I'm excited to see some more of the planets and moons when the game comes out on the 24th, but at least Tylo looks pretty good. Zooming in a bit though reveals something bizarre. Either my rover apparently has some sort of hover technology, or it's just bugged off the ground. This isn't the only terrain issue I've seen either. Looking at my Kerbal and Duna, they just stand a little oddly. Now, it's just a little unsettling to have things rest so far off the texture planes, and I hope that they can calm that down a bit. Now, one thing I wanted to loop back to is the user interface. This, like I said before, is a massive revamp from the first game, and from a distance, it has some massive upsides. In the vehicle assembly building, parts are organized in these little trays that make it easy to find whatever you're looking for. The buttons on the bottom for editing position and rotation of parts are massively improved as well, with the functions making a lot more sense than in the first game. I really like how rotate and move are now one combined thing, letting you locate parts a lot more fluidly. Now, the bottom right of the screen is home to the staging UI, and this looks way better than the first game. The launch button is at a commanding spot on the bottom of the screen, rather than just being tucked away on top. Stages are clearly laid out, and while I didn't like the way they dragged around, I'm sure it's something that I'll get used to. Now, on the bottom left, there's a new button to toggle between building vertically and horizontally. This is because there's no space plane hangar anymore, and only a single unified assembly building. This is a topic I'll save for later later, but by doing this, it creates some unique issues. Going to launch this rocket, we get to see the flight UI, which looks a little different. We have this solid block of data on the bottom here that, while pretty, is a little overwhelming at first. One thing I greatly appreciate is that going to launch the rocket, you get this cool little launch countdown now, which makes the whole experience feel a little more real. This is skippable though if you don't have 10 seconds to give every single time you want to launch the rocket. Now, moving along much more in the flight, I want to focus more on the UI and some of both the good and bad things about it. Now, you can see that as I started to extend my trajectory, the path increased as expected, but now we get this little red exclamation that marks where we're gonna crash. This is a nice little touch that makes it a little more understandable what's going on, especially to new players. Now, in that same vein, the sphere of influence bubbles around every body makes it way easier to see if you're gonna encounter something. The maneuver node has had a lot of stuff changed under the hood, but in terms of using it, it feels roughly the same. The only annoyances I had was that moving it around doesn't seem to work, and warping to a maneuver near a body, or anywhere else for that matter, will give you this proximity to celestial body error message that feels a little bugged. It's also pretty easy to accidentally overshoot a burn since this tiny little bar is your only feedback for how much you need to still go. Now, there's plenty of other minor UI things I could go on about, such as the engine fuel display and the staging menu, but I want to change gears a little bit and talk about building. Now, as I hinted out before, the spaceplane hangar and the vehicle assembly building are now one. There's a button on the bottom to switch between the two modes, and depending on what type of crew capsule you put down, the layout will try to automatically adjust to what you're doing. Now, this is a great idea in theory, since everything is just done from one central location, but in reality, it makes building planes a symmetry nightmare, and wings would very often appear backwards or sideways or just not right at all. Now, these wings you see here are actually the new procedurally generated wings. I can make them pretty much whatever size I want, including sizes that make very little sense. As a quick aside, I actually did try flying this, and I was impressed that at the very least it appeared to create a little lift. Moving over to my little red plane, you can see a much more sane approach to modeling the wings, and I really like how they automatically include control surfaces, so you don't need to think about adding extra panels at all. Other than the wings though, building feels very similar to the first game, which in my opinion is a great thing. Connecting fuel tanks is still just as simple as stacking them right on top of each other, and while it took me a second to find, the symmetry tool is still right there for adding on many more copies of the same assembly. This tool was acting a little strange for me, and some of the other people I talked to frequently just not copying things right, especially if you tried adding rings of parts on existing rings of parts. But this at least seems very buff-outable, so to speak. Ferry construction was a little weird to pick up at first, but I came around to liking it. Instead of just clicking to create each stage, which is a little imprecise and uneditable, now you could just move around each piece more methodically. I'm not sure it's better, but it's at the very least not worse. Now I'm just gonna take a second here and scroll through all of the parts in the catalog, and while I didn't get to use them all, the parts there seemed awesome. Sometimes the odd change from KSP1 would throw me off, like how engine plates don't decouple things below them, or how liquid fuel's been renamed to Methalox, but the parts all were nice. One thing I was a little sad to see was that there's no motors, hydraulics, or any other robotic parts in the catalog. Now these are part of a DLC for the first game, but I use motors so much they feel like a core gameplay mechanic, and it's a shame to see them gone. Now, in the time I had, I built a ship to go to Duna, a plane, and the rocket that was supposed to carry that plane to Lathe. This felt like a good representation of small, medium, and large builds, and I got some insight into the issues that the new VAB has. Besides what I've already mentioned with the symmetry problem, I had a few very strange movement bugs with my plane and performance issues with the large rocket, but I'm happy to say that it's nothing too major. With the rockets now built though, we need to launch them, and that leads us nicely to talking about KSP2's physics. This was a bit of a wild ride, but I'll start with the basics. The upshot is that the physics feel extremely similar to the first game. Maneuvering my ship around, ejecting into Duna, and even just landing felt identical to before. The more interesting bits are the idiosyncrasies visible only when looking closer at the footage. The first major change I could feel was instability. Reaction wheels are way weaker now, and just trying to burn off Kerbal, I was having some massive stability issues despite not really being unbalanced at all. After stacking on far more reaction wheels and a few fins, I was able to stay pointing forward. This was also apparent with my large rocket, which despite being very laggy and difficult to control anyway, it always seemed to veer in one direction and be extremely hard to pull back. The second major change I felt was in trying to get encounters. points. When I first escaped Kerbal, I started to plan my maneuver with Duna, which I already had set the proper launch window for. Now I can see here that 3 points came up labeled 1A, 1B, and 2B. This took me a second to figure out what was going on, but these are the closest approach icons. I don't know why, but I had a heck of a time getting these to move where I wanted, let alone getting them to line up so I could get an encounter. Once I finally did, I struggled a lot to figure out where I was going to be intercepting Duna. Now apparently this is a bug, but if we zoom in on Duna here, you can see where I'm going to be entering and exiting the sphere of influence, but not the actual path I'm taking. This is really important for making sure I dip into the atmosphere just the right amount for arrow braking, and I could only make this appear once I got in the sphere of influence, which is pretty late. Now you've also probably noticed that there's something weird going on with this clip, and it is in fact blurred. Now I'm gonna rewind a bit before I encountered Duna. Back here, I was just trying to make my way to Duna, and I had loaded a save, but from that point until I restarted the game, I had a rock constantly spawning inside of me and literally chasing me around wherever I went. Now ordinarily, I might not have cared, but it was blowing off massive parts of my rocket each time, so this was a pretty big issue. Now the reason that it's blurred is that the developers told me this is an accidental asset that I really shouldn't share, so I'll honor that, but I tried loading the save again to get rid of this, and it didn't do anything. I even tried going to the main menu, and somehow it was literally there too. Finally, after a reset though, it went away, and it was back to my actual mission. Now, besides all this weirdness though, the mission was otherwise unharmed, and I went back to my descent into Duna. Now, this again, I'll make into a second video in a few days, so subscribe if you don't want to miss that. I'm beginning to run out of good ways to transition between segments, so I'll just show you some footage and say one word. Performance. This is a rocket with a fairly high number of parts on it, and you can probably tell that the frame rate's a little rough. I went ahead and created the most similar rocket I could in KSP1 and put them side by side. Keep in mind too that these are the system specs I was playing on an ESA versus my personal computer. This is quite significant, and I want to dig into what's going on with KSP2 a little more. Now, I'm not a game designer, but there's some low-hanging fruit that I will pick here that would drastically help frame rates. This rocket had a lot of parts because I have a massive amount of struts on it. You can see here just how many metal bars there are, and this is for 2 main reasons. Firstly, attachment points feel extremely loose in this game versus the first game. Just slapping a Clydesdale engine right on a radial decoupler will result in some unacceptable deformations. This is unfortunate since it means you are required to add on more struts to keep it together, which of course is what's adding the lag. Now I can already hear the KSP veterans in the comments furiously typing, why didn't you just use auto strut? Well, the reason is that it just doesn't exist. This one kind of boggles my mind, but auto strut at the very least isn't in the game at release. This means that instead of just clicking one button and have everything automatically held in place, you are required to manually put down struts to hold your rocket together, which means that you're required to have worse performance. This, combined with the fact that the symmetry tool is acting a little jank, led me to using way more struts than I ever wanted to, tanking my performance. Now, I was rushing to build this since I only had about half an hour left to get this plane to lathe, which I ultimately failed at anyway. So if you're being careful, you shouldn't need this many, but it's just lame how the game is actively playing against itself here. Now, aside from that little rant, performance otherwise felt fairly acceptable, although it's difficult for me to really judge anything since I was playing on the bleeding edge of hardware. Now, it's as I'm writing the script, they released the minimum system requirements, and they're pretty steep to be perfectly honest. At the very least though, I didn't feel any lag spikes during play, and loading times were surprisingly short. One thing my regular viewers might have noticed by now is that this video actually has game audio. I generally don't record game audio since my voice seems to never stop going anyway, but I thought that it would be crucial for this video. Now, between the drone of activity in the vehicle assembly building, and here the realistic roaring of the engines, and the adaptive music, this game has some of the best audio I've ever heard. Going back to the engine sounds, there's such an incredible attention to detail here. The engine's pitch will noticeably change the further out of the atmosphere you get. Different types of engines have distinct, rich sounds that are genuinely breathtaking. Not only does the engine audio adapt, but the music does too. If you listen closely, launching gives you this fun, triumphant music. Orbit gives you this more ethereal vibe. Deep space is even more ethereal and drawn out. And attempting to land gives you this suspenseful and tense music. These tracks are amazing. It sounds like I'm watching a movie with how well they mesh into each other as well. I'm gonna come off script for a second here to just say that everything about the sound of this game is literally perfect. Kerbal Space Program 1 is a game that I enjoy greatly. I feel like I could do just about anything I want, whether it's pulling off a technically challenging mission or building a ridiculously large rocket. It's also a game that I'm not sure I want to relearn again because it's just so complicated and unhelpful towards new players. With the changes made in KSP2 though, I hope that it can alleviate some of that learning pains that more people can experience the gorgeous graphics, the brisk building, and the outstanding audio. At the end of the day though, while under close inspection, there are quite a few bugs and other messes to clean up. As a whole, Kerbal Space Program 2 is phenomenal, and there's no chance of ever going back.